My wife's dad called me a relic and fired me after 15 years of loyalty to his company. He never bothered to check who the anonymous majority shareholder was. The next day at the board meeting, he saw me at the head of the table and, you know what they say about loyalty in corporate America? It's about as valuable as a penny stock during a market crash. But hey, I was young, dumb, and fresh out of Columbia Law School with stars in my eyes and a naive belief that hard work actually meant something in this cutthroat world of billionaire fortunes and hostile takeovers. 15 years. 15 goddamn years I gave to Harold Vance and his so-called boutique law and tech consulting firm. Boutique, that's rich. When I started, the place was hemorrhaging money faster than a Series B startup burning through venture capital funding. The office looked like something out of a 1990s legal drama, complete with outdated filing systems and a compliance department that couldn't tell the difference between securities fraud and tax evasion if their lives depended on it. I walked in there straight from law school graduation, still wearing my cap and gown like some kind of legal superhero cape, thinking I was going to change the world one contract at a time. Harold hired me as a compliance analyst, basically the corporate equivalent of a hall monitor. My job? Make sure the firm didn't accidentally commit any federal crimes while chasing after those sweet billionaire client retainers. But here's the thing about being underestimated in the legal industry. It gives you one hell of an advantage. While everyone else was fighting for the spotlight in board meetings and trying to schmooze their way onto the Forbes list, I was in the trenches, doing the actual work that kept the lights on in the U.S. Attorney's office from knocking down our doors. I stayed late every night, drafting airtight contracts that would make even the most paranoid private equity fund managers sleep soundly. I learned the ins and outs of corporate litigation strategy from the ground up, studying every case like it was going to be on the bar exam. I became Harold's right-hand man, his deputy manager in everything but title, the guy who knew where all the bodies were buried, metaphorically speaking, of course. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was building a legacy for someone else's family estate, while my own track record spoke for itself. But I believed in something quaint and old-fashioned called loyalty. I thought it meant something in this world of IPOs and going public, where most people change jobs faster than they change their LinkedIn profiles. When Harold's daughter Sarah walked into our offices for a summer internship during her MBA at Wharton, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. She was smart, driven, and had that Upper West Side penthouse kind of sophistication that comes from growing up around money. We started dating, and suddenly I wasn't just an employee anymore. I was family. Or so I thought. I married Sarah in a ceremony that would have made the society pages of CNBC if we'd been important enough. The reception was held at the Grand Meridian Ballroom, complete with crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than my first year's salary. Harold spared no expense, and I should have realized then that throwing money around like confetti was going to be a recurring theme in our family dynamics. But love makes you stupid, and marriage makes you invested, literally. I put my own money into the firm, buying equity like I was some kind of venture capitalist with more balls than brains. I believed in the vision, in the potential, in the idea that we could be the bridge between old-school law practice and new-age legal tech solutions. That's when I really started earning my keep. I brought relationships with venture capital firms to the table, connections I'd made during my law school days when I was networking harder than a desperate startup founder at a Silicon Valley mixer, that I convinced Harold to invest in our first SAS-based compliance platform, a move that seemed risky at the time, but ended up being pure gold. The legal tech startup I brought in its series of funding? It's now valued at $1.2 billion and trending on Twitter every time they announce a new feature set. Their ransomware protection and cybersecurity software have become industry standard, and we were early investors thanks to my due diligence and risk profile analysis. I thought I was building something permanent, something that would last. I thought family and business were inseparable, like assets in a diversified portfolio. I thought loyalty mattered more than market positioning or strategic partnerships. I thought I was creating a sustainable increase in value for everyone involved. For 15 years, I was the steady one. While Harold chased flashy acquisitions and tried to get us featured in TechCrunch, I was making sure we had repeat customers and word-of-mouth referrals that kept the revenue flowing. While he was dreaming of going public and making it onto the Forbes list, I was ensuring we could pay everyone on time and maintain our client list. I restructured our compliance department, brought in officers who actually knew the difference between regulatory issues and operational hiccups. I negotiated contracts with engineering firms, handled class action lawsuits that could have bankrupted us, and managed client accounts like they were my own personal inheritance. The firm went from shaky to profitable, from a small accounting firm mentality to a legitimate player in the legal tech space. We started getting invites to charity galas at venues that charged $48,000 a night just for the privilege of existing. Harold started wearing Armani suits and driving BMWs, sipping Macallan 25-year-old scotch like he was some kind of corporate royalty. And through it all, I kept my mouth shut and did the work. I thought that's what loyalty looked like: quiet competence, steady results, being the guy who could be counted on when the chips were down. I thought I was building something that would outlast hostile takeovers and market crashes, something that would be part of my legacy. I thought wrong. Loyalty, as it turns out, is just another word for naive in the corporate world. And family? Well, that's just a word people use right before they screw you over in the most spectacular way possible. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That revelation was still coming, served up with a side of public humiliation and a healthy dose of reality. You want to know what 15 years of loyalty gets you in the corporate world? A front row seat to your own professional execution, served with a side of premium scotch and enough humiliation to last a lifetime. The venue Harold chose for my firing wasn't some sterile boardroom or quiet corner office. Oh no, that would have been too dignified for a man who'd clearly watched too many episodes of corporate drama and thought dramatic flair was a legitimate business strategy. Instead, he rented out the penthouse event space at the Meridian Tower, a $48,000 a night Manhattan venue that screamed, "Look at me, I have more money than sense." The place was all floor-to-ceiling windows, marble floors that probably cost more than most people's annual salary, and the kind of crystal chandeliers that made you feel like you were attending a charity gala for entitled assholes. I should have known something was up when Sarah, my wife, Harold's daughter, and apparently the world's most spineless human being, suggested we meet there for what she called a family business discussion. In hindsight, that phrase should have set off more red flags than a Chinese military parade. But hey, I was still operating under the delusion that family meant something in this equation. Harold was already there when I arrived, standing by those ridiculous floor-to-ceiling windows like he was posing for the cover of Fortune magazine. He had that look, you know the one I'm talking about. That smug, self-satisfied expression that successful men get when they're about to destroy someone's life, and they think they're being clever about it. He was wearing a Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than my first car, and in his hand was a crystal tumbler filled with what I immediately recognized as Macallan 25-year-old. The irony wasn't lost on me that he was drinking scotch that cost more per ounce than most people make in an hour, in a venue that cost more per night than most people's mortgage payments, to fire the guy who'd made it all possible. But then again, irony has never been in short supply in the corporate world. It's probably the only renewable resource we've got. "Arthur," he said, not bothering to turn around when I walked in. "Glad you could make it. Sarah's running a bit late. Board meeting with the venture capitalists from New York Investment Group. You understand how it is with Series B funding rounds." I understood. All right. I understood that my own wife was probably getting briefed on how to react when her father destroyed her husband's career. But I played along, because that's what 15 years of corporate conditioning does to you. It makes you polite even when you're walking into your own execution. "Nice place," I said, looking around at the obscene display of wealth. "Special occasion?" Harold finally turned around, and that's when I saw it. The look. Not the usual condescending paternalism I'd grown accustomed to over the years, but something colder. Something that suggested the man who'd once called me his right-hand man had already mentally written my obituary. "You could say that," he replied, taking a sip of that liquid gold. "I've been thinking about the future of the firm, about where we're headed in this new economy. Legal tech is moving fast, Arthur. Faster than I think some people can keep up with. Here it comes," I thought. The speech. Every corporate executioner has one. The carefully rehearsed monologue that's supposed to make the victim feel like their professional death is somehow for the greater good. I'd seen it happen to others over the years, but I'd never expected to be on the receiving end. Shows how much I knew about loyalty in the age of private equity and hostile takeovers. "The thing is," Harold continued, swirling that scotch like he was conducting a symphony. We need people who can move at the speed of innovation. People who understand that in today's market, you're either disrupting or you're getting disrupted. There's no middle ground anymore. I wanted to laugh. This from the man who still printed out emails and asked his secretary to explain Twitter to him on a monthly basis. This from the guy who thought blockchain was something you put on a bicycle. But I kept my mouth shut and let him continue his performance. I've been talking to some consultants, McKinsey types, and they've convinced me that we need a complete restructuring. New blood, fresh perspectives, people who grew up digital instead of having to adapt to it. McKinsey consultants. Of course, because nothing says, I'm about to make a terrible business decision, quite like paying 7 figures to have a bunch of Ivy League MBAs tell you what you want to hear. I'd seen this playbook before, usually right before companies hemorrhaged talent and lost half their client base to competitors. Sarah walked in right on cue, like this whole thing had been choreographed. She was wearing a designer dress that probably cost more than most people's rent, and she had that look. The same look women get when they're about to watch their husbands get fed to the corporate wolves and they've already decided not to intervene. Sorry I'm late, she said, not making eye contact with me. The VC meeting ran long. You know how these private equity guys are. They want to see every line item in the portfolio before they commit to the next funding round. I should have realized then that she was speaking in code, that every word out of her mouth was designed to remind me of my place in the pecking order. But I was still clinging to the naive belief that marriage meant something, that family loyalty trumped corporate politics. Harold set down his glass and looked me dead in the eye. Arthur, I'm going to be direct with you. We need to make some changes. Your approach, methodical, cautious, deliberate, it worked for us in the past. But frankly, you're becoming a relic. A relic. The word hit me like a punch to the gut, not because it was insulting, but because it was so perfectly calculated. Harold had always been good with words. It's why he'd made partner at his old firm before going solo. He knew exactly which buttons to push to make it hurt. You're too slow for today's corporate world, he continued, picking up his scotch again like this was just another business discussion. We need people who can think on their feet, who can adapt to market changes in real time. The compliance work you do is solid, don't get me wrong, but solid isn't enough anymore. We need aggressive. We need innovative. I stood there listening to this man. This man whose firm I'd saved from bankruptcy, whose daughter I'd married, whose legal tech investments I'd secured, tell me that 15 years of loyalty and competence were somehow insufficient for the modern economy. The same modern economy that was built on exactly the kind of steady, methodical work I'd been doing all along. But here's the thing about corporate betrayal. It's never really about performance or innovation or any of the buzzwords they throw around in board meetings. It's about power, control, and ego. Harold hadn't fired me because I was ineffective. He'd fired me because I'd become too effective, too integral to the firm's success. I was a threat to his narrative of indispensability. I think it's time for you to explore other opportunities, he said, as if he was doing me some kind of favor. Sarah and I have discussed it, and we both agree this is the right move for everyone involved. I looked at my wife. The woman who'd promised to love, honor, and cherish me, the woman whose family business I'd helped build, and waited for her to say something, anything, in my defense. But she just stood there, silent as a church mouse, studying her manicured nails like they held the secrets of the universe. You know what's funny about being publicly humiliated in a $48,000 a night venue? The walk to your office afterward feels like a goddamn funeral march, except you're both the corpse and the only mourner stupid enough to show up. Every employee, paralegal, and compliance officer in that marble-floored monument to legal mediocrity knew exactly what had just happened. Word travels fast in corporate America, faster than insider trading tips and twice as damaging to your reputation. The elevator ride up to my office felt longer than a Senate judiciary hearing. 23 floors of pure, unadulterated corporate shame, with each ding of the elevator marking another second of my professional life circling the drain. I could practically feel the whispered conversations happening behind closed doors, the kind of office gossip that spreads through law firms like ransomware through an unprotected network. Did you hear? Arthur got the axe. Finally, Harold's been wanting to restructure for months. I heard it was brutal. Called him a relic right to his face. His own wife was there and didn't say a word. Yeah, I could imagine the conversations. In the legal industry, there's nothing quite like watching a partner get publicly executed to remind everyone else of their own mortality. It's like being a witness to a corporate car crash. You can't look away, but you sure as hell don't want to be next. My corner office on the 23rd floor had been my sanctuary for the better part of a decade. Floor-to-ceiling windows with a view of Central Park, a mahogany desk that cost more than most people's cars, and enough legal tomes to stock a small law library. The kind of office that screamed, "I've made it," to anyone who walked in. Now it felt more like a mausoleum, a monument to 15 years of misplaced loyalty and corporate naivety. The security guard was already waiting for me when I stepped off the elevator. Rodriguez, good guy, been with the firm longer than most of the senior associates. He had that uncomfortable look that security personnel get when they have to escort someone they actually like to clean out their desk. Part sympathetic, part professional, all awkward as hell. "Mr. Jennings," he said, nodding respectfully. "I'm sorry, but I have to stay with you while you pack up. Company policy. Company policy. Right." Because apparently, after 15 years of building this place from a struggling boutique firm into a profitable legal tech hybrid, I was now considered a flight risk. Like I was going to stuff the office printer into my briefcase and make a run for it. "No problem, Rodriguez," I said, pulling out my Tom Ford briefcase, a gift from Sarah when I made partner. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd be using her gift to carry away the remnants of my career. This shouldn't take long. And it didn't. 15 years of corporate life fit into a single cardboard box that Rodriguez had thoughtfully provided. My law school graduation diploma from Columbia, the one that had cost me 6 figures in student loans and 3 years of my life. My framed shareholder certificate from when I'd bought equity in the firm, back when I still believed that ownership meant security. A few legal textbooks that were probably outdated by now anyway. The law moves fast, but not as fast as corporate betrayal apparently. The Mont Blanc pen Sarah had given me when I made partner sat in its presentation case like a monument to better times. Meister stuck 149, platinum-coated, with my initials engraved on the cap. For my brilliant husband, the card had read, "May this pen sign many successful deals." Well, it had certainly signed its share of contracts. Too bad none of them had been worth a damn when push came to shove. I packed up my personal photos, the obligatory wedding shot, a few pictures from company retreats and charity galas, that awkward group photo from Harold's 60th birthday party at his Downton Abbey-style estate in the Hamptons. Everyone smiling like we were one big happy family, like loyalty and hard work actually meant something in the grand scheme of corporate politics. The rest of the office would stay behind. The awards from the New York State Bar Association, the certificates from compliance training seminars, the thank you notes from clients whose asses I'd saved from federal investigators and class action lawsuits. Let Harold explain to the next guy why half our client accounts were structured the way they were, or why our risk profile had improved so dramatically over the past decade. Rodriguez watched silently as I worked, probably wondering how someone goes from corner office to cardboard box in a single afternoon. The security cameras in the corner were recording everything, no doubt feeding directly to Harold's office, so he could watch his former right-hand man pack up like some kind of twisted corporate reality show. Other employees walked by my office door, some pretending not to look, others offering sympathetic nods or uncomfortable waves. Jenkins from the compliance department looked like he wanted to say something but thought better of it. Smart guy? In corporate America, solidarity with the recently terminated is a luxury most people can't afford. Better to keep your head down and hope the axe doesn't fall on you next. The funny thing was, I wasn't angry. I should have been furious, should have been plotting revenge or planning my next career move, or at least feeling some kind of righteous indignation about the whole situation. But instead, I felt something else entirely. Something that probably would have worried Harold if he'd been paying attention instead of celebrating his latest strategic victory. I felt amused. Not the bitter kind of amusement you get from watching someone else's misfortune, but the quiet, knowing kind of amusement that comes from understanding something that everyone else has missed. Like being the only person in a room who gets the punchline to a really good joke. See, Harold had made a fundamental error in his corporate calculus. He'd assumed that firing me would solve his problems, that removing what he perceived as deadweight would streamline his operation and make room for all that younger blood he'd been craving. He'd treated me like an employee, like someone whose value to the organization began and ended with my ability to show up and do the work. But Harold had never been particularly good at due diligence. It's why he'd nearly lost the firm during the 2008 financial crisis, why he'd made so many bad acquisition decisions over the years, why he needed someone like me to handle the actual business of running a business while he focused on playing corporate kingpin. If he'd been better at due diligence, he might have taken a closer look at the shareholder registry. He might have wondered why certain equity transactions had been structured the way they were, or who exactly was behind some of the shell companies that had invested in the firm during its more vulnerable moments. He might have asked himself why his trusted right-hand man had been so willing to take a backseat role despite clearly having the competence to run the show himself. But Harold had always been more interested in the appearance of power than the mechanics of it. He loved the corner office, the board meetings, the networking events at country clubs where successful men gathered to congratulate themselves on their success. The actual work, the contracts, the compliance issues, the financial structuring that kept it all legal and profitable, that was for other people to worry about. As I taped up the cardboard box and prepared to take my walk of shame, I smiled. Not the defeated smile of a man whose career had just been destroyed, but the quiet, confident smile of someone who knew a secret that was about to change everything. Rodriguez escorted me to the elevator, probably expecting some kind of emotional breakdown or angry outburst. Instead, I thanked him for his professionalism, shook his hand, and stepped into the elevator with my single box of personal effects. The ride down felt different this time. 23 floors of anticipation instead of shame. Each ding of the elevator marking another second closer to the moment when Harold would realize that firing Meme hadn't solved his problems. It had created new ones he couldn't even imagine. Everyone thought I was done, finished, relegated to the corporate scrap heap of middle-aged executives who'd outlived their usefulness. They thought the quiet guy who'd spent 15 years in the background was finally being shown the door he should have walked through years ago. They had no idea what was coming next. You want to know the difference between being smart and being clever in the corporate world? Smart people see opportunities and take them. Clever people create opportunities and let other people think they're taking them. 15 years ago, during the financial crisis that nearly brought down every overleveraged, underregulated business from Wall Street to Silicon Valley, I wasn't just smart. I was fucking clever. It was October 2008. And the world was going to hell in a handbasket made of subprime mortgages and credit default swaps. Lehman Brothers had just collapsed like a house of cards built by drunk economists. AIG was getting bailed out by taxpayers who couldn't spell derivative if their lives depended on it, and every private equity fund in Manhattan was hemorrhaging money faster than a Series A startup with no business model. Harold's firm wasn't immune to the carnage. Hell, we were probably more vulnerable than most. Small boutique law firms don't exactly have the kind of diversified client portfolio that weathers economic tsunamis. When your biggest clients are mid-sized corporations whose stock prices are falling faster than gravity, and your bread-and-butter work consists of mergers and acquisitions that nobody can afford anymore, you're basically fucked with a capital F. I remember the day Harold called me into his office. The same office where he'd fire me 15 years later, though it looked a lot shabbier back then. The mahogany desk had water stains from coffee cups, the leather chairs were cracking at the seams, and the view of Central Park was partially obscured by scaffolding from the building renovation we couldn't afford to finish. "Arthur," he said, and I could hear the desperation in his voice like a bad poker player with a losing hand. "We need to talk about the numbers." The numbers. Christ, the numbers were ugly. Our biggest client, a mid-sized manufacturing company, had just filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, taking their 7-figure annual retainer with them. 3 other clients had terminated their contracts, citing budgetary constraints. Corporate speak for, "We're broke as a joke and can't afford lawyers anymore." Our accounts receivable looked like a graveyard of unpaid invoices, and our cash flow was negative enough to make a venture capitalist weep. But here's where it gets interesting. While Harold was panicking about immediate survival, I was thinking about long-term strategy. While he was focused on keeping the lights on for another month, I was calculating what this firm could be worth in 5 years if someone, say, a forward-thinking investor with balls of steel and a high risk tolerance, bought in at distressed prices. The hostile takeover attempt came from Morrison & Associates, a mid-tier private equity fund that specialized in acquiring distressed professional service firms. Their offer was insulting. Basically a fire sale that would have left Harold with enough money to retire to Florida and spend his golden years complaining about the weather. But for the employees, the clients, and anyone who gave a damn about the firm's legacy, it would have been a death sentence. Morrison's business model was simple. Buy struggling firms for pennies on the dollar, strip out anything valuable, and either flip them to larger competitors or shut them down and sell off the assets. They were corporate vultures, and Harold's firm was roadkill waiting to be devoured. That's when I made my move. Not the obvious move, the one where I march into Harold's office and offer to help save the day like some kind of white knight in a Tom Ford suit. No, that would have been smart. What I did was clever. I incorporated Bedrock Partners LLC on a Tuesday afternoon in November 2008, filing the paperwork through a small Delaware incorporation service that specialized in privacy-focused business structures. Delaware, the incorporation capital of America, where more than half of all Fortune 500 companies are legally domiciled, and where corporate secrecy is protected like state secrets. The name wasn't accidental. Bedrock, solid, foundational, the kind of thing you build empires on. I wanted something that sounded stable and trustworthy, the kind of entity that institutional investors would feel comfortable doing business with. Not flashy, not aggressive, just solid. The kind of name that would look good on shareholder documents and wouldn't raise any red flags during due diligence reviews that I funded Bedrock Partners with money I'd been saving for years. Not just my salary, but bonus payments, profit-sharing distributions, and a healthy chunk of inheritance money from my grandmother's estate. Old Pennsylvania steel money, the kind of generational wealth that comes from great-grandfathers who actually built things instead of just shuffling papers around. It wasn't billionaire fortune levels, but it was enough to make a real difference in a distressed market. The beauty of the 2008 financial crisis, from an investment perspective, was that everything was on sale. Distressed assets, fire sale prices, motivated sellers who were more concerned with liquidity than valuation. It was like Black Friday for sophisticated investors, except instead of fighting over discounted televisions, you were acquiring equity positions in businesses that would be worth 10 times more once the market recovered. I started buying Harold's firm's distressed shares through a series of carefully structured transactions. Not all at once. That would have attracted attention and driven up the price. Instead, I worked through intermediaries, shell companies, and strategic partnerships that made it look like multiple investors were buying in rather than a single entity accumulating control. Every time Morrison & Associates made another lowball offer, more shares would mysteriously become available at slightly better prices. Every time Harold looked like he might accept their hostile takeover bid, another investor would emerge with a marginally better alternative. It was like playing chess with people who thought they were playing checkers. The genius of the strategy wasn't just the financial engineering, it was the psychological warfare. Harold was so focused on fighting off Morrison & Associates that he never stopped to wonder who these new investors were or what their long-term intentions might be. He was grateful for any alternative to corporate execution, even if he didn't fully understand where the alternatives were coming from. I structured every transaction to comply with securities regulations, federal disclosure requirements, and state corporate law. Everything was legal, everything was properly documented, and everything was designed to fly under the radar of anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. Due diligence? I was the guy who wrote the firm's due diligence procedures. Risk assessment? I had designed our risk profile analysis protocols from the ground up. By the time the dust settled in early 2009, Bedrock Partners controlled 62% of Harold's firm. Not through a single massive acquisition that would have triggered disclosure requirements or regulatory scrutiny, but through dozens of smaller transactions that individually looked like routine investment activity. Death by 1,000 cuts, except in reverse, resurrection by 1,000 investments. Harold never asked the right questions. He never wondered why so many investors were suddenly interested in his struggling firm. He never questioned why the acquisition terms were so favorable to existing management, or why the new investors seemed so hands-off about day-to-day operations. He He was just grateful to have survived Morrison and Associates' hostile takeover attempt. The beautiful irony was that Harold thought he'd won. He'd fought off the corporate vultures, maintained control of his firm, and secured enough capital to weather the financial crisis. He gave interviews to legal industry publications about the importance of strategic partnerships and the value of patient capital. He probably thought he was some kind of corporate mastermind. But here's what Harold never understood about corporate governance. Control isn't about titles or corner offices or who gets their name on the letterhead. Control is about votes. Control is about board meetings and shareholder agreements and the kind of legal documentation that determines who actually runs the show when push comes to shove. I never put my name on any of the contracts. I never demanded a seat on the board of directors. I never asked for public recognition or credit for saving the firm. I just quietly accumulated the votes, structured the agreements, and waited for the right moment to exercise the power I'd been building for over a decade. Because here's the thing about clever people in corporate America. We don't need the spotlight. We don't need the recognition. We just need the leverage. And when the time comes to use that leverage, when some ungrateful son of a bitch decides to call us relics and fire us in front of our own wives, we smile quietly and remember that patience is the ultimate corporate weapon. Harold thought he was firing an employee. What he was actually doing was waking up his boss. You know what they say about revenge being a dish best served cold? That's amateur hour bullshit. Real revenge, corporate revenge, isn't served cold. It's served at room temperature, with perfect documentation, and witnessed by a board of directors who can't do a damn thing to stop it. And it tastes better than a $2,000 bottle of Macallan 25 shared with people who actually deserve your company. My Upper West Side penthouse felt different that night. Not because anything had physically changed. The floor-to-ceiling windows still offered the same million-dollar view of Central Park. The marble countertops still gleamed under the recessed lighting, and my Tesla Model S Plaid was still parked in the private garage 30 floors below. But the energy was different. Electric. Like the moment before a thunderstorm when you can feel the atmospheric pressure shifting and you know something big is about to happen. I poured myself 3 fingers of Macallan 25. The same brand Harold had been sipping while he destroyed my career, except mine was from my personal collection, not some overpriced corporate entertainment budget. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was drinking better scotch than the man who'd just fired me, in a home that probably cost more than his annual revenue. But then again, Harold had never been particularly good at connecting dots or understanding the bigger picture. I loosened my Tom Ford tie. The charcoal gray one Sarah had bought me for our 5th wedding anniversary, back when she still pretended to give a shit about our marriage. Funny how a piece of silk can carry so much emotional baggage. I should probably burn the thing, but it was a damn good tie, and letting Harold's betrayal ruin my taste in neckwear would be giving him too much power over my life. The steel security case sat in my home office like a monument to paranoia and forward thinking. Biometric lock, fireproof construction, the kind of thing that government contractors use to store classified documents. Overkill for most people's important papers, but then again, most people don't spend 15 years quietly accumulating enough corporate leverage to stage a bloodless coup. Inside the case was a leather binder that would make any compliance officer weep with joy. Not because it was beautiful, though the Italian leather was admittedly gorgeous, but because it contained the kind of documentation that corporate lawyers dream about. Every I dotted, every T crossed, every legal requirement satisfied with the kind of obsessive attention to detail that comes from spending your entire career in regulatory compliance. The binder was organized with the precision of a Supreme Court brief and the thoroughness of a federal investigation. Section 1. Articles of Incorporation for Bedrock Partners, LLC, complete with Delaware filing receipts and corporate registration documents. Section 2. Shareholder Agreements, meticulously drafted to comply with securities regulations and structured to provide maximum flexibility in corporate governance decisions. Section 3. Board resolutions, proxy statements, and voting agreements that would make a private equity fund manager jealous. But the real masterpiece was buried in Section 4, the original bylaws of Harold's firm, as amended and restated over the past 15 years. Most people think bylaws are boring corporate housekeeping, the kind of legal paperwork that gets filed away and forgotten until someone needs to settle a dispute about board meeting procedures or voting rights. But bylaws are actually the DNA of corporate power. They determine who can do what, when they can do it, and how much notice they have to give before they blow up someone's world. Article 7, Section 2 was my favorite piece of legal craftsmanship. Not because I'd written it. Harold's original corporate attorney had drafted the language back when the firm was still small enough to meet in his kitchen, but because I'd recognized its potential and made sure it survived every subsequent revision and restructuring. The majority shareholder reserves the right to call an emergency board meeting with 48 hours notice to all directors and officers, provided such notice is delivered in writing and specifies the general nature of the business to be conducted. 48 hours. 2 business days. Less time than it takes most people to plan a weekend dinner party, and I could completely restructure the leadership of a multi-million-dollar law firm. It wasn't a loophole. Loopholes are accidental gaps in legal documentation that clever lawyers exploit. This was a deliberate feature, designed by paranoid founders who wanted to make sure they could act quickly if their company was ever threatened by hostile forces. The beautiful irony was that Harold had no idea this provision existed. Oh, he'd signed off on the bylaws over the years. Corporate governance requires regular board approval of fundamental documents. But Harold had always been more interested in the business side of running a law firm than the legal mechanics. He left the boring stuff to people like me, people who actually understood that corporate power flows through documentation, not personality. I flipped through the pages like a general reviewing battle plans. Proxy statements that would allow me to vote the shares of smaller investors who'd be more than happy to side with new management. Board resolutions that would restructure the firm's executive leadership with surgical precision. Shareholder agreements that would protect the interests of employees and clients while removing the cancer that had been metastasizing in the corner office for far too long. Everything was legal. Everything was properly documented. Everything was designed to withstand the kind of legal challenges that desperate former executives tend to file when they realize they've been outmaneuvered by someone they thought was beneath them. I'd spent 15 years building this corporate weapon, and Harold had just given me the perfect reason to use it. My phone sat on the desk next to the binder, and I stared at it for a long moment before picking it up. The contact list read like a who's who of Columbia Law School alumni who'd gone on to successful careers in corporate governance. But the name I was looking for was special. James Morrison, chairman of the board of directors, and my former study partner from constitutional law class. Morrison wasn't related to the vultures who'd tried to acquire the firm during the financial crisis. That was just one of those cosmic coincidences that make you believe in poetic justice. James Morrison was old-school corporate governance, the kind of guy who actually read shareholder agreements before signing them and understood that board service was a fiduciary responsibility, not a social networking opportunity. I'd recommended him for the board position 3 years earlier, when Harold was looking to add some gravitas and institutional credibility to the firm's governance structure. What Harold really wanted was a prestigious name he could drop at charity galas and country club dinners. What he got was a man who took corporate oversight seriously and wouldn't hesitate to do the right thing when presented with clear evidence of management failure. The call connected on the second ring. "Arthur," Morrison said, and I could hear the surprise in his voice. "I heard about today. I'm sorry, that must have been difficult." Word traveled fast in legal circles, especially when it involved public humiliation at expensive Manhattan venues. I wondered if Morrison had heard about Sarah's silence or Harold's speech about relics and modern corporate agility. Probably both. "James," I said, settling back in my leather chair with the scotch warming my throat and the binder open in front of me. "I need to call an emergency board meeting. Article 7, Section 2 of the corporate bylaws. I'm invoking my rights as majority shareholder." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for about 10 seconds. Long enough for Morrison to process what I'd just said, cross-reference it with his understanding of the firm's ownership structure, and arrive at the inevitable conclusion that Harold had just made the biggest mistake of his professional life. "Jesus Christ, Arthur," Morrison finally said, and I could practically hear him smiling through the phone. "How long have you been sitting on this?" 15 years, I replied, taking another sip of scotch and feeling the weight of corporate justice settling into place like pieces of a perfectly crafted legal argument. "But I think it's time to stop sitting." The revolution would begin in 48 hours. And Harold wouldn't see it coming until it was far too late to stop. You want to know the beautiful thing about having leverage in corporate America? It's not just the power to destroy people, though that's certainly satisfying when they've earned it. It's the power to ignore them completely while they slowly realize they're fucked. There's something almost zen-like about watching powerful people discover that their power was always an illusion, especially when they're calling you every 5 minutes begging for explanations you're under no obligation to provide. My iPhone started buzzing at 6:47 a.m., exactly 13 hours after I'd placed the call to James Morrison. I was in my home gym, working through my morning routine on a Peloton that cost more than most people's cars, when Harold's name appeared on the screen like a bad rash that wouldn't go away. I let it go to voicemail and increased my resistance level. Physical fitness and emotional satisfaction, killing two birds with one perfectly timed corporate stone. The second call came while I was in the shower, steam rising from heated marble floors that probably cost more than Harold's first year's salary at his old law firm. Sarah this time, no doubt calling on Daddy's behalf because Harold was too proud to grovel directly. I watched her name flash on the screen through the glass shower door and felt absolutely nothing. Not anger, not sadness, not even the bitter satisfaction I'd expected. Just the cold indifference you feel toward people who've revealed their true character when it mattered most. By the time I'd finished my morning routine, espresso from a machine that cost more than some people's monthly rent, fresh pressed juice from organic ingredients that probably traveled further than most Americans ever will, my phone showed 17 missed calls and 43 unread text messages. It was like watching a car crash in slow motion, except I was safely inside a reinforced vehicle watching other people realize they'd been driving without seatbelts. Harold called again while I was reading the Wall Street Journal and eating breakfast that probably cost more per plate than his compliance department's monthly coffee budget. This time I actually picked up, not because I wanted to talk to him, but because I was curious to hear what panic sounded like in a man who'd spent his entire career believing he was untouchable. Arthur, thank God. Harold's voice came through the speaker with the kind of desperation usually reserved for people calling their lawyers from jail cells. We need to talk. There's been some kind of misunderstanding about the shareholder registry. Misunderstanding. That was rich. Like accidentally acquiring majority control of someone's company was the corporate equivalent of a simple accounting error. I took a sip of my espresso, Ethiopian single-origin beans that probably cost more per pound than Harold paid his paralegals per hour, and let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Arthur, are you there? I'm here, Harold, I said, not bothering to hide the amusement in my voice. Just enjoying my coffee. You know how it is. Retired people have all the time in the world for the simple pleasures. I could practically hear his blood pressure spiking through the phone. Retired? Arthur, you're not retired. There's been some kind of mistake with the corporate filings. Morrison called this morning talking about emergency board meetings and majority shareholders. I need you to explain what's going on. The beautiful thing about corporate karma is that it's always perfectly timed. Harold had spent 15 years treating me like an employee whose opinions were occasionally useful, but ultimately disposable. Now he was calling me before 8 a.m., begging for explanations like a first-year associate who'd just realized he'd missed a filing deadline. No mistake, Harold, I said, picking up a piece of toast topped with what was probably the most expensive avocado in Manhattan. Everything's been filed properly with the appropriate regulatory agencies. Due diligence was conducted according to securities regulations. All shareholder notifications have been delivered in compliance with Delaware corporate law. Another pause, longer this time. I could almost hear the wheels turning in Harold's head as he tried to process the fact that his former right-hand man was speaking to him in the same tone he usually reserved for opposing counsel in hostile litigation. I don't understand, Harold said, and for the first time in 15 years, he was telling the absolute truth. How can you be a majority shareholder? When did this happen? How could I explain 15 years of patient investment strategy to a man who thought corporate planning meant deciding which charity gala to sponsor for maximum networking value? How could I describe the beauty of Delaware incorporation law to someone who'd never bothered to read his own company's bylaws? It's been happening for quite some time, Harold, I said, walking over to my floor-to-ceiling windows to watch the morning traffic crawl through Central Park. You might want to review your shareholder agreements. Article 7, Section 2 is particularly relevant to your current situation. I hung up before he could respond, not out of anger, but out of sheer indifference to whatever excuses or explanations he might offer. The time for conversation had passed the moment he'd called me a relic in front of my wife and expected me to quietly disappear into corporate obscurity. The calls kept coming. Sarah tried again, probably with instructions from Daddy about how to handle her suddenly dangerous husband. The CFO called. Poor bastard was probably trying to figure out how the financial statements he'd been preparing for years had somehow missed a majority ownership position. Even a venture capitalist called, some guy from a Series B funding round who'd probably heard rumors and wanted to understand whether his investment was about to get restructured by new management. I ignored them all, not because I was being petty, though I'll admit there was a certain satisfaction in watching Harold's carefully constructed world start to crumble, but because I was no longer required to explain myself to people who'd never bothered to understand my value when it mattered. The best call came from Rebecca Chun, our general manager and one of the few people in the firm who actually deserved her position. She'd worked her way up from paralegal to department head through pure competence, the kind of person who understood that sustainable growth came from client satisfaction and operational excellence, not flashy acquisitions and celebrity networking. "Arthur," she said when I finally answered, "I just wanted you to know that not everyone agreed with what happened yesterday. Some of us have been hoping for changes in leadership for quite some time." That was interesting. While Harold had been playing corporate king in his corner office, the actual managers, the people who handled client accounts and managed daily operations, had apparently been watching his performance with the same enthusiasm most people reserve for root canal procedures. "I appreciate that, Rebecca," I said. "I think you'll find the next few days quite interesting from a corporate governance perspective." "I'm hoping so," she replied. "This place used to be about the work. Lately, it's been more about Harold's ego than our clients' needs." After I hung up with Rebecca, I finally checked my text messages. 43 little windows into the panic that was spreading through Harold's inner circle like ransomware through an unprotected network. Sarah's messages started apologetic and quickly escalated to accusatory. Harold's were demanding, then pleading, then threatening legal action. The CFO was asking for emergency meetings. Even some of the junior associates had heard rumors and were texting about job security. But the most interesting message came from an unknown number with a Manhattan area code. "Mr. Jennings, this is David Walsh from the U.S. Attorney's Office. We'd like to discuss some matters related to your former employer. Please call at your earliest convenience." Now that was unexpected, not concerning. Everything I'd done was perfectly legal and properly documented, but certainly intriguing. It suggested that Harold's troubles might be bigger than just losing control of his own company. Federal investigators don't usually call about routine corporate governance disputes. I made a mental note to return Walsh's call after the board meeting. If Harold was facing regulatory issues or compliance problems, it would certainly explain why he'd been so eager to restructure the firm's leadership. Nothing quite like impending federal scrutiny to make a man desperate for scapegoats. My phone buzzed one more time. Harold again, probably working up the courage for another round of increasingly desperate explanations. I turned the phone off completely and walked out to my private balcony, 30 floors above the street noise and corporate drama. Tomorrow's board meeting was going to be more interesting than I'd originally planned. You know what's beautiful about corporate power? It doesn't announce itself with trumpets and fanfare like some medieval coronation. Real power walks quietly into a room wearing a perfectly tailored suit, sits down at the head of the table, and waits for everyone else to figure out that the game has fundamentally changed. And when it finally speaks, it doesn't need to raise its voice, because everyone in the room suddenly understands that their professional survival depends on listening very, very carefully. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that makes Manhattan feel like the center of the corporate universe. I stood in front of my walk-in closet, bigger than most people's bedrooms, and made a deliberate wardrobe choice that would send exactly the right message. Not the conservative gray suits Harold had always mocked as too cautious for modern business. Not the navy blue that screamed, safe corporate drone. Today called for something different. Midnight black Tom Ford, cut to perfection by a tailor who probably charged more per hour than most lawyers billed their clients. The kind of suit that cost more than some people's cars and made a statement before you even opened your mouth. Hermes tie in charcoal silk, subtle enough to suggest understated confidence rather than nouveau riche desperation. Cufflinks that had belonged to my grandfather. Old Pennsylvania steel money. The kind of generational wealth that built railroads and didn't need to prove itself to anyone. I took my time getting ready, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted to savor every moment of this corporate transformation. 15 years of being Harold's reliable deputy manager, and now I was about to walk into that boardroom as the majority shareholder with enough votes to restructure the entire executive team. It was like watching yourself evolve from supporting actor to director in your own corporate drama. My Tesla Model S Plaid was waiting in the private garage, detailed to showroom perfection and probably worth more than Harold's annual salary back when he was starting his legal career. The drive to the office took 23 minutes through Manhattan traffic, 23 minutes of anticipation that felt like the longest and shortest ride of my professional life. The Meridian Tower looked different somehow, like a building I was seeing for the first time instead of a place where I'd spent the better part of 2 decades. The same marble lobby, the same crystal chandeliers, the same corporate grandeur that was designed to intimidate clients and impress visiting venture capitalists. But today, walking through that lobby felt like arriving at my own coronation rather than reporting for duty. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor boardroom felt different too. Instead of the familiar anxiety of preparing for another meeting where Harold would take credit for my work and dismiss my suggestions, I felt the calm confidence that comes with holding all the cards in a poker game where everyone else is still trying to figure out what's trump. The boardroom itself was Harold's pride and joy, floor-to-ceiling windows with views of Central Park, a conference table that probably cost more than most people's annual income, and leather chairs that squeaked just enough to remind everyone how expensive they were. It was designed to intimidate, to make visiting clients and potential investors feel like they were in the presence of serious money and established power. I arrived exactly at 9 o'clock, not early enough to seem eager, not late enough to appear disrespectful. The other board members were already seated, 5 of them, including James Morrison at his usual spot near the head of the table. Morrison caught my eye and nodded almost imperceptibly, the kind of subtle acknowledgement that passes between people who understand that corporate governance is about to get very interesting. The empty chair at the head of the table, Harold's usual throne, sat waiting like a monument to executive privilege about to be toppled. I walked past it deliberately and took the seat to its immediate right, the chair I'd occupied for countless board meetings as Harold's deputy and designated note-taker. Not today. 5 minutes later, the boardroom door burst open like Harold was making his entrance in some kind of corporate action movie. He was flanked by the CFO and the firm's general counsel, both of whom looked like they'd spent the night reviewing shareholder agreements and Delaware incorporation law, trying to figure out how their understanding of the company's ownership structure had been so catastrophically wrong. Harold's face was flushed, not the healthy glow of a man who'd spent the morning exercising in his private gym, but the stressed-out redness of someone whose blood pressure had been spiking for the past 48 hours. His usually immaculate Tom Ford suit looked wrinkled, like he'd slept in it or spent the night pacing around his office trying to figure out how to undo a corporate coup that had been 15 years in the making. His eyes scanned the room, probably looking for some sign that this was all an elaborate practical joke or a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a few phone calls to the right people. Instead, he saw 5 board members sitting quietly, waiting for the meeting to begin, and his former deputy manager sitting calmly in what had always been his designated supporting role. "What the hell is going on here?" Harold demanded, his voice carrying the kind of executive authority that had intimidated subordinates and impressed clients for decades. Except today, in this room, with these people, that authority sounded more like desperation than confidence. James Morrison cleared his throat and consulted the leather portfolio in front of him. "Harold, please take a seat. We have some important corporate governance matters to discuss this morning." "Corporate governance?" Harold's voice cracked slightly. "Jim, I called you yesterday about some kind of mistake in the shareholder registry. Arthur here seems to think he has some kind of ownership position that—" "There's no mistake," Morrison interrupted, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd spent 30 years in corporate law and understood exactly how these situations played out. "We've reviewed all the relevant documentation with the firm's outside counsel. Everything appears to be in order." That's when Harold's eyes finally landed on me, really looked at me for the first time since he'd walked into the room. Not the dismissive glance he usually gave his subordinates, but the kind of focused attention you give to a problem that needs to be solved or an enemy that needs to be neutralized. "Arthur," he said, his voice dropping to the tone he usually reserved for opposing counsel in hostile litigation. "I think we need to discuss this privately before we involve the board in what's obviously some kind of misunderstanding." I smiled. Not the polite, deferential smile I'd perfected over 15 years of corporate servitude, but the quiet, confident smile of someone who'd just realized they were holding a royal flush in a game where everyone else was bluffing with pair of twos. "No misunderstanding, Harold," I said, my voice carrying a calm authority I'd never been allowed to use in this room before. "Everything's been properly filed and documented. Morrison has the paperwork if you'd like to review it." Morrison slid a thick manila folder across the mahogany table. Harold opened it with trembling hands, his eyes scanning shareholder agreements, proxy statements, and Delaware Incorporation documents that laid out in excruciating legal detail exactly how thoroughly he'd been outmaneuvered. "This is Arthur Jennings," Morrison announced to the room, his voice carrying the formal tone of corporate ceremony, representative of Bedrock Partners, LLC, the majority shareholder of this firm. The words hung in the air like a verdict being read in a criminal trial. Harold's jaw dropped open, literally dropped open, like he'd just been told that gravity had stopped working or that the SEC had decided to start enforcing securities regulations. For the first time in 15 years, Harold Vance was speechless. And in that moment of perfect corporate silence, I understood that my transformation was complete. I was no longer the loyal deputy, the reliable second-in-command, the man behind the curtain who made everything work while someone else took the credit. I was the majority shareholder. I was the controlling interest. I was the man who owned the room. You know what's funny about corporate executions? They're nothing like the movies make them out to be. No dramatic music, no last-minute speeches about friendship and loyalty, no passionate appeals to shared history. Just a room full of people in expensive suits following proper parliamentary procedure while someone's entire professional life gets systematically dismantled with Robert's Rules of Order and a simple show of hands. Harold sat in his chair like a man who'd just been diagnosed with a terminal illness by 5 different doctors who all agreed on the prognosis. The manila folder lay open in front of him, its contents spread across the mahogany table like evidence in a white-collar crime trial. Shareholder agreements, proxy statements, Delaware Incorporation documents. 15 years of perfectly legal corporate maneuvering that had somehow escaped his attention until this moment. "I don't understand," Harold said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Bedrock Partners, when did this happen? How long have you been?" 15 years, I replied, enjoying the way the number hit him like a physical blow. "Since the financial crisis. Since Morrison and Associates tried their hostile takeover. Since you needed someone to save your ass and were too proud to ask for help directly." The color drained from Harold's face as the timeline clicked into place. I could practically see the mental calculations happening behind his eyes. Every major decision over the past decade and a half, every board meeting, every strategic restructuring that he'd thought was his idea, but it actually required my approval as majority shareholder. James Morrison consulted his watch and cleared his throat. "Gentlemen, we have a full agenda this morning. Arthur, as the representative of Bedrock Partners and our controlling shareholder, would you like to address the board?" I stood up slowly, not because I needed the dramatic effect, but because I'd been waiting 15 years for this moment, and I wanted to savor every second of it. The other board members, successful lawyers and business executives who'd seen plenty of corporate coups in their careers, watched with the kind of professional fascination that comes from witnessing a master class in long-term strategic planning. "Thank you, James," I said, my voice carrying the authority I'd never been allowed to use in this room. "I've called this emergency meeting to address what I believe are serious concerns about the current leadership and strategic direction of this firm." Harold's head snapped up like he'd been slapped. "Strategic direction? Arthur, yesterday you were my deputy manager. You can't just—" "Yesterday, I was your employee," I corrected, my tone remaining calm and professional despite the satisfaction I felt in watching him squirm. "Today, I'm your majority shareholder. And as majority shareholder, I have significant concerns about recent executive decisions that I believe are detrimental to the firm's long-term viability and client relationships. Morrison nodded and consulted his notes. Please proceed, Arthur. The board is prepared to hear your concerns. I opened my own leather portfolio, not quite as expensive as Harold's, but infinitely more useful given that it contained actual documentation rather than empty corporate theater. Over the past 18 months, this firm has made a series of questionable strategic decisions that have damaged our reputation, strained our client relationships, and created unnecessary financial risk. I pulled out the first document, a summary of failed acquisitions that Harold had pursued despite my objections and the board's reservations. The attempted acquisition of Rosewood Tech, a cybersecurity software company with questionable financials and a management team under federal investigation for securities fraud. Total cost to the firm, $12.3 million in due diligence fees, legal expenses, and opportunity costs. Harold opened his mouth to object, but Morrison held up a hand. Let him finish, Harold. The failed partnership with Silicon Valley Legal Solutions, a legal tech startup that burned through $8.7 million in series of funding before filing for bankruptcy. Our firm's investment, $2.4 million that we'll never see again, plus the reputational damage from being associated with a company that's now being investigated for tax evasion and fraudulent investor statements. I could see the other board members taking notes, their expressions growing more serious with each item on my list. These weren't minor operational hiccups. These were major strategic blunders that had cost the firm millions and damaged relationships with venture capital partners who might have provided legitimate opportunities. The restructuring of our compliance department, I continued, which resulted in the dismissal of 3 experienced compliance officers and the elimination of our internal audit function. This decision was made despite warnings from our outside counsel about increasing regulatory scrutiny in the legal services industry. Board member Patricia Williams, a former federal prosecutor who joined us 2 years earlier, leaned forward in her chair. Arthur, are you suggesting that these compliance issues might expose the firm to federal investigation? I'm not suggesting anything, I replied. I'm stating facts. Yesterday morning, I received a call from David Walsh at the U.S. Attorney's Office requesting a meeting to discuss matters related to this firm. I can only assume they're interested in our compliance procedures, or lack thereof. The silence in the room was deafening. Federal investigators don't call for social visits, and everyone in that boardroom understood the implications. Harold's face went from pale to ashen, like he'd just realized that his problems were bigger than losing control of his company. There's more, I continued, pulling out another document. The mismanagement of client accounts, including the Henderson Industries portfolio that we nearly lost due to inadequate attention and poor communication. The disastrous product launch strategy for our legal tech platform that resulted in a 40% decline in user adoption and $3.2 million in development costs for features that our clients didn't want and couldn't use. With each item, I watched Harold sink deeper into his chair. This wasn't just a corporate coup. It was a systematic dismantling of his executive track record, delivered with the kind of precision that comes from spending 15 years documenting every mistake while quietly fixing the problems behind the scenes. The board needs to consider whether current leadership is capable of addressing these issues and restoring client confidence, I concluded, or whether new leadership is required to protect the firm's reputation and ensure its continued viability in an increasingly competitive market. Morrison looked around the table at his fellow board members. I think we need to vote on a resolution of no confidence in current executive leadership. All in favor. The first hand went up immediately. Patricia Williams, who'd probably seen enough federal investigations to know which way the wind was blowing. Then Dr. Robert Chun, our technology advisor who'd watched Harold bungle one AI investment after another. Then Margaret Foster, who'd been questioning Harold's acquisition strategy for months. One by one, 5 hands rose into the air like flags of surrender in Harold's personal corporate war. Not dramatically, not with any particular emotion, just the methodical process of corporate governance in action. Harold stared at those raised hands like he was watching his own funeral. His empire, built over decades of networking, schmoozing, and taking credit for other people's work, had just been voted out of existence in less than 5 minutes. The motion carries, Morrison announced with the formal tone of a judge delivering a verdict. Effective immediately, Harold Vance is removed from his position as chief executive officer and chairman of the board. Harold tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, but no words came. What could he say? That the vote was unfair? That 15 years of documented failures somehow didn't count? That the board should ignore federal investigations and client complaints because of his winning personality? Harold, I said, my voice carrying a mixture of professional courtesy and personal satisfaction, I think it's time for you to clean out your office. For the first time in 15 years, Harold Vance had nothing to say. You know what's interesting about power? Most people think it's about making grand gestures and dramatic announcements, like some kind of corporate superhero swooping in to save the day with flashy acquisitions and revolutionary strategies. But real power, sustainable power, is about understanding that the best leadership is usually invisible. It's about fixing problems so quietly and efficiently that most people don't even realize there were problems to begin with. When the board turned to me after Harold's removal, 5 pairs of eyes looking for direction from the man who'd just orchestrated the most polite corporate execution in Manhattan legal history, I didn't launch into some inspirational speech about vision and transformation. I didn't pound the mahogany table and declare a new era of aggressive expansion and disruptive innovation. Instead, I spoke simply and directly, the way I'd always preferred to communicate before Harold's ego started requiring everything to sound like a TED Talk. We are not chasing vanity acquisitions, I said, my voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd been quietly running things behind the scenes for 15 years. We're not burning capital on flashy AI investments without proper due diligence and compliance oversight. We return to what made us strong: solid contracts, reliable litigation support, and trusted client partnerships. Patricia Williams nodded approvingly. As a former federal prosecutor, she understood that sustainable growth came from building relationships and maintaining standards, not from chasing every shiny tech startup that promised to revolutionize the legal industry with machine learning algorithms nobody really understood. What about current client accounts? Asked Dr. Robert Chun, our technology advisor who'd watched Harold bungle one digital transformation initiative after another. Some of our key relationships have been strained by recent management decisions. That was putting it diplomatically. Harold's obsession with modernization and aggressive market positioning had alienated several long-term clients who'd come to us precisely because we were dependable rather than trendy. The Henderson Industries account, worth $3.2 million annually, had been threatening to move their business to a more traditional firm after Harold tried to force them into a legal tech platform they didn't want or need. I'll be reaching out personally to our top 20 clients, I replied. Not to sell them anything or pitch them on new services, but to listen, to understand their needs and concerns, to rebuild the trust that's been damaged by treating client relationships like line items in a venture capital pitch deck. Margaret Foster, our financial oversight board member, leaned forward. And the compliance issues? The federal investigation? That was the elephant in the boardroom. The reason this corporate coup had been not just justified but necessary. David Walsh from the U.S. Attorney's office didn't call successful law firms for casual conversations. Federal investigators have better things to do than chat with compliance officers about their weekend plans. First priority, I said, pulling out another document from my leather portfolio. I'm reinstating the compliance department Harold dismantled. Linda Rodriguez, Maria Santos, and James Park, 3 experienced compliance officers with impeccable track records who were dismissed as part of Harold's streamlining initiative. They'll all be offered their positions back with full restoration of benefits and seniority. I could see the relief on Morrison's face. As chairman of the board, he'd been legally responsible for the firm's governance even while Harold had been systematically weakening the very systems designed to keep them out of federal custody. Bringing back experienced compliance professionals wasn't just good business. It was essential for avoiding the kind of regulatory scrutiny that could destroy a law firm overnight. What about the technology investments? Chen asked. The legal tech platform, the AI initiatives, the SaaS integration projects? Harold had been obsessed with being featured in TechCrunch and getting invited to Silicon Valley conferences where he could network with venture capitalists and startup founders. He'd invested millions in bleeding-edge legal technology that looked impressive in press releases but created more problems than it solved for actual clients. We'll conduct a complete audit of all technology investments, I replied. Anything that's actually improving client service and operational efficiency gets continued funding. Anything that's just expensive digital theater gets quietly discontinued. Our clients don't care if we're trending on Twitter. They care if we can draft contracts that protect their interests and handle litigation that preserves their assets. The legal apprenticeship program was next on my restoration list. Harold had eliminated it 6 months earlier, claiming that formal training programs were too slow for today's fast-paced legal environment. What he really meant was that mentoring junior associates took time away from his networking events and press conferences. We're bringing back the apprenticeship program, I announced. 2-year structured training for new associates, with senior partner mentorship and rotation through different practice areas. It costs money, but it produces better lawyers and stronger client relationships in the long run. William smiled. That program produced some of our best associates. I never understood why it was eliminated. Because Harold thought everything could be solved with software and outsourcing, I thought, but didn't say. Because he'd rather spend money on flashy acquisitions than on developing the kind of institutional knowledge that actually makes law firms successful. The meeting concluded with assignments and timelines that felt refreshingly practical after years of Harold's grandiose strategic planning sessions. Real deadlines for actual problems, not aspirational goals for revolutionary market disruption. Within 3 months, I wanted client satisfaction surveys completed, compliance protocols restored, and a realistic assessment of which technology investments were worth preserving. Over the following weeks, I discovered just how much damage Harold's leadership had inflicted on the firm's operational foundation. Client accounts that should have been routine renewals were being shopped to competitors. Talented associates were quietly updating their LinkedIn profiles and taking calls from headhunters. The compliance department's absence had created gaps in regulatory filings that could have triggered federal investigations even without whatever had prompted David Walsh's call. But restoration, it turned out, was easier than I'd expected. The basic infrastructure was still solid. I'd made sure of that during my 15 years of quiet stewardship. The client relationships just needed attention rather than revolution. The technology systems needed optimization rather than replacement. The staff needed leadership rather than inspiration. Rebecca Chun, our general manager, became my closest ally in the restoration process. She'd been quietly holding things together while Harold chased his corporate fantasy, managing day-to-day operations with the kind of competent professionalism that actually keeps law firms profitable. It's like watching the place come back to life, she told me one afternoon as we reviewed client retention numbers that had stabilized for the first time in 18 months. People are actually focusing on the work again instead of worrying about which department's getting eliminated next. The financial results spoke for themselves. Within 6 months, revenue had climbed 23% compared to Harold's final year as CEO. Not because we'd landed some massive new client or launched a revolutionary legal tech platform, but because we'd returned to the fundamentals that had made the firm successful in the first place. Competent legal work, reliable client service, and the kind of operational stability that allows good lawyers to do their best work. Client referrals increased. Associate retention improved. The compliance department earned recognition from the New York State Bar Association for best practices in regulatory adherence. We weren't making headlines in business publications, but we were making money and serving clients, which, it turned out, was exactly what we should have been doing all along. Harold's vision of disruption and transformation had nearly destroyed everything we'd built. My vision of restoration and competence had saved it. 6 months after the boardroom coup that sent shockwaves through Manhattan's legal circles, I sat in my corner office, the same one Harold had occupied for 15 years, sipping Macallan 25 and watching the sun set over Central Park. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd finally claimed the throne I'd been quietly building for over a decade, only to discover that power felt exactly like I'd expected, satisfying, but not transformative. Harold vanished like a bad merger, rumors floating through legal industry cocktail parties about private equity, hush money, and NDAs thick enough to choke a securities lawyer. Some said he'd moved to Florida. Others claimed he was consulting for offshore investment funds. I didn't particularly care. Men like Harold always land somewhere. Corporate mediocrity is surprisingly portable. Sarah filed for divorce 3 weeks after the board meeting, her attorney citing irreconcilable differences, as if my refusal to remain a doormat constituted some kind of personal failing. She kept the Hamptons house. I kept my self-respect and majority ownership of a now profitable law firm. Fairtrade. My Tesla Model S Plaid still occupied the same spot in the private garage. My Tom Ford suit still hung in the same walk-in closet, and my Upper West Side penthouse still offered the same million-dollar views. But everything felt different now, not because the trappings of success had changed, but because I'd finally stopped pretending someone else's approval mattered more than my own competence. The firm thrived under actual leadership. Client retention hit 94%, associate satisfaction scores reached all-time highs, and our compliance department became the gold standard other firms tried to emulate. We weren't the flashiest law firm in Manhattan, but we were dependable, profitable, and exactly what our clients needed us to be. In corporate law, finance, and life, I'd learned the most important lesson of all. It's not about who speaks the loudest in boardroom meetings or gets featured on CNBC business segments. It's not about hostile takeovers or venture capital funding rounds or getting your name trending on Twitter after some revolutionary legal tech announcement. Real power, sustainable power, belongs to whoever owns the room. And ownership, as it turns out, is just another word for patience.